Hey everyone, and welcome to this deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at a business model that I'm sure you've at least heard whispers about online. It's those companies that are sometimes called Devil Corp,
Right.
and we've got a whole bunch of Reddit posts and articles about them,
Okay.
all about DS Max and Smart Circle and just tons of other names.
Yeah, it seems like you've run into this firsthand.
Yeah.
And you're really looking to understand what it is and how it all works.
Yeah, exactly. So let's just dive right in, I guess. The whole Devil Core thing, it's like a puzzle with 1,000 pieces. But they all have different names on them.
Yeah.
You know, DS Max, Smart Circle, Cydcor, Innovage.
Yeah.
It's almost like they're playing hide and seek, wouldn't you say?
It really is. I think that's a good observation. And that constant name changing that you pointed out, it really does make it hard to keep track of these companies,
Right.
especially for people who are trying to decide, is this somewhere I want to work?
Exactly. Like in this Reddit post here where someone's asking about DS Max back in the early 2000s, like tons of people chimed in and they had all these stories about applying for what seemed like normal jobs. And then it turned out that things were not at all what they seemed.
That's a really common theme we see.
Right.
These companies, they use really vague language in their materials that they use to recruit people and appealing promises that make it really hard to figure out what the job actually is.
Yeah, and there's a story here about the Coral Group in Denver,
So,
and it was a super quick interview process. And they were talking about running your own marketing firm.
right.
And then they had the classic line, "We only promote from within."
Yeah, big red flags there.
Huge red flags.
Those are classic tactics that are used in multi-level marketing structures or MLMs, which is what these devil core companies often are.
Yeah.
And this idea of like rapid advancement in entrepreneurship is a really powerful draw, especially for younger people who are looking for jobs.
Yeah, it sounds like they're selling a dream, not a job.
Exactly.
Right.
And the dream can be really persuasive, especially when we live in a society that's kind of obsessed with entrepreneurship and getting rich quick.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Then there's this other story about Child Safety Inc. And on the first day, they had everyone at like a pep rally.
Oh, wow.
And they were chanting about long-term goals.
Okay.
Sounds kind of cult-like.
It does a little bit. That intense motivational atmosphere is another thing we see with these organizations. They
Right.
really try to create this high energy environment that encourages people to conform and discourages them from thinking critically.
Yeah, and it seems to work for some people.
Yeah.
I mean, this person, Signal Maintenance 1, says, "I high-rolled the office for a couple months straight and was soon awarded leader. I was used to being exploited in factories. Peddling was a nice change, to be honest."
Wow. That's a really powerful example of how these systems can appeal to people who have already been exploited in other situations.
Yeah.
Those quick promotions and those titles like leader, they make people feel like they have status and achievement, which they might not have had in their previous jobs.
Right. So to understand how this all came to be, we have this article called Background the Truth Behind Door-to-Door Jobs.
Okay.
And it really breaks down the history of DS Max and its many transformations.
This is a great overview of how DS Max evolved. It started out as WM Industries, Inc., then it became Wholesale Warehouse Industries, and then it finally took on the name DS Max.
Right.
But it didn't stop there. It branched out and created what we call descendant companies, like Innovage, the Smart Circle, Cydcor.
It's like a corporate hydra. Cut off one head and two more grow back.
Yeah, I like that analogy. That's a good one. And that constant evolution, that branching out, it makes it so hard to track and regulate these companies.
Yeah.
They can change their names faster than lawmakers can keep up with them.
Right. And there's this one quote from the article that really stood out to me. The big three had proven that a good attitude could sell anything, to sell the sizzle, not the steak.
I think that quote really gets to the core of their sales philosophy. It's about creating excitement and hype. Right.
It doesn't really matter what the product is or what the actual value is. It's all about convincing people to buy into that dream.
The sizzle.
The sizzle, not the steak.
And that brings us to this website that definitely doesn't mince words.
Okay.
It's called DS Max Scam the Devil Core. And they call it a corporate horror story.
Yeah.
And an insanely wicked direct sales cult.
This website has a really critical perspective, and the language is really harsh.
Yeah.
But it reflects how negative some people's experiences have been working for these companies.
And they make a pretty bold claim. They say, DS Max, Smart Circle, Cydcor, Innovage, Granton, Quantum, the Landers Group, Cobra Group, Perdiem, Credico, Apco Group, Optimo, International, Sociomax, etc. are the exact same company. They all have the same system, run the same scam, and are owned by the same people. What do you think about that?
It's hard to say for sure. While there are definite similarities in their practices and their structure,
Right.
and some connections between the people who are in leadership positions, it's tough to say without more evidence whether they're all literally the same company. Okay. The website also lists top 10 signs you're in a devil core. And some of these are pretty unsettling.
Like what?
Like having to tell people that you're working on an advertising campaign when you're actually going door to door or participating in cult-like rituals at the office.
This list, even though the language might be a little exaggerated, it does touch on the common criticisms of these organizations, like the deceptive recruitment practices, the high-pressure sales tactics, and even attempts to control employees' lives outside of work.
It sounds like they're blurring the lines between work life and personal life.
Yeah, and that can be really problematic. It's important for people to have boundaries between their work and their personal lives.
Right.
And these companies seem to really push those boundaries in ways that are concerning.
Yeah, and speaking of personal experiences, we also have a whole bunch of posts from the Devil Corp subreddit.
Oh, interesting.
People are sharing their stories and warnings about these companies.
It's great that online platforms like Reddit provide these spaces for people to connect and share information about what they've been through.
Right.
It can be really empowering for people to see that they're not alone and to learn from other people who've had similar experiences.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of people are using these platforms to try and expose what they see as harmful practices.
Exactly. The internet has become such a powerful tool for holding corporations accountable and giving a voice to people who might otherwise not be heard.
Yeah. So we've got all of these sources, some painting a really dark picture, and others acknowledging the dedication and drive of the people involved.
Yeah, it's interesting.
But then we have this website by Eric Wolfram,
Okay.
a page called the DS-Max History, as it is explained.
Okay.
And he acknowledges the negative aspects of DS-Max, but he also gives credit to the company's origins and highlights the charismatic leadership of its founder, Murray Reinhart.
Wolfram's website is an interesting one. He tries to provide a more balanced view
Right.
while still acknowledging the criticisms.
And there's this one quote that stood out to me. Nevertheless, I have to give credit where credit is due. This business started out of the back of a car that was being lived in by the founder. And now it is around the globe. 24 hours a day, people are doing the 5 and 8 because they are inspired by the actions of Murray and the many others that have followed his dream. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's important to recognize that these organizations didn't just appear out of thin air.
Right.
There's a history there, a story of ambition and hard work, even if the way they achieve success is questionable. It's also a good reminder that people are drawn to these opportunities for different reasons, including the desire to be a part of something bigger than themselves.
Yeah, it kind of humanizes the story a bit.
Yeah.
It reminds us that there are real people behind these companies.
Exactly.
People with dreams and aspirations.
People who are willing to do whatever it takes.
And maybe a willingness to do whatever it takes to achieve them. So we've got this tapestry of sources, some really dark and some acknowledging the dedication and drive. But what about the people who are just starting to come across these companies? We've got this Reddit post titled, "Had an interview with a Devil Corp yesterday," and it is just full of classic red flags.
This post is a great example of what people should look out for during the recruitment process.
Yeah.
The poster describes this overly enthusiastic interviewer, a really vague job description, and they put a lot of emphasis on earning potential and the chance to be a manager.
Right.
All very common tactics used to lure people in.
Yeah. And the poster eventually realizes that the job is door-to-door sales.
Wow.
With a commission-based pay structure.
Not what they were expecting.
Not at all.
That's one of the key points. The way that these jobs are presented is often completely different from the reality.
Yeah.
They focus on the dream, the potential to get rich and be successful, but they downplay the actual work involved.
Yeah. And there's this one line in the post that stood out to me. He was like, "Oh, so you prefer to do 9-to-5 job with hourly pay, so you like to play safe."
It makes me cringe a little bit when I hear that.
Right.
The classic tactic. They're trying to make people feel ashamed of wanting stability and security. And they want to present traditional employment as like boring and unambitious.
Right.
And their opportunity as the only way to be truly successful.
It's like they're saying, if you're not willing to risk it all, you're not worthy of success.
Wow. Yeah, that's a powerful way to put it. They really prey on people's insecurities and aspirations.
Right.
They often target people who are young and inexperienced and eager to prove themselves.
So it's not just about selling products, it's about selling a whole worldview.
Exactly. And part of that worldview is this big emphasis on individualism and personal responsibility.
Yeah.
They promote this idea that anyone can achieve success if they work hard enough,
No matter what.
no matter what their circumstances are.
Which sounds great on the surface, but it really ignores systemic issues
Totally.
and places all the blame on individuals for not being successful.
That's a really crucial point. Their rhetoric often ignores the very real issues of social and economic inequality.
Yeah.
And they promote this belief system that benefits the people at the top while exploiting the people at the bottom.
And this worldview seems to tie in with the social isolation that we see in a lot of these cases, right? Like, they discourage employees from hanging out with friends and family.
Right.
Who don't support their involvement in the business.
That's another common tactic. They want to limit any outside influences that might challenge their narrative or encourage people to leave.
Yeah, it's like they're trying to create a bubble where their ideas are the only truth.
It's a way of controlling the information that people are exposed to and maintaining their influence.
And this isolation makes it even harder for people to see that they're being manipulated.
Oh, absolutely. When everyone around you is saying the same thing, it can be really difficult to step back and look at things objectively.
Yeah, it's a classic example of how cults operate.
Exactly. They isolate individuals from their support systems. So that they become more dependent on the group.
For everything.
For their sense of identity, for belonging, for everything.
Okay, so we've got this deception in the recruitment process.
Right.
A focus on selling a dream, not a job. And this constant pressure to achieve.
It's a pretty potent combination.
Yeah, it is. But not everyone buys into the negative narrative about these companies.
That's true.
We've got this post from the Raw Devil Corp subreddit.
Okay.
Had the opportunity to talk with a Smart Circle owner.
Interesting.
And it presents kind of a different point of view.
It's so important to consider a variety of viewpoints. This post challenges the dominant narrative we see online and suggests that not everyone has a bad experience with these companies.
And this is a quote that really sums up their stance. I'm sorry to who this may offend, but it seems like most of the people in here often are coping with either failing at sales or getting a CI tracked and losing it. And it's the same, maybe 50 people who comment on most posts and stir up the most.
That's a really interesting point. It suggests that the really negative voices that we hear online could be coming from a small group of people. And that there are a lot of other people who are actually finding success and fulfillment in these organizations.
It also highlights the potential for confirmation bias, where people tend to look for and interpret information in a way that just confirms what they already believe.
Exactly. We have to be really careful not to assume that one person's experience represents the whole truth. It's so important to consider all the different viewpoints and recognize that experiences can vary a lot from person to person.
And the poster also talked about running into multiple YouTube channels, all created by the same individuals who framed them as independent media, and their efforts to deplatform these so-called devil corps.
That's interesting. It makes you think about the reliability of information online. And the motivations behind different sources. It can be really hard to tell what's genuine and what's biased or even manipulative.
Yeah, especially with the rise of social media.
Exactly. Information can spread so quickly and easily these days. It's like a game of information warfare.
It is.
With different sides trying to control the narrative.
And we as consumers have to be so discerning.
Totally. We're living in this age of information overload. And it's more important than ever to be critical of what we're reading and watching and to think about the sources we're getting our information from.
So we've got this really complex web of experiences and perspectives and claims surrounding these companies.
A lot to take in.
Where do we go from here?
I think the key takeaway here is that it's a really complicated issue. And there are no easy answers. We have to be careful about those overly simplistic narratives.
Yeah, both positive and negative.
Exactly. We have to come at this with a critical and open mind.
So I think this is a great place to wrap up part 1 of our deep dive.
Okay.
We've explored the history, the controversies, the different experiences, but there's still a lot more to uncover.
There is. In part 2, we're going to dig a little deeper into the psychology of it all. And the ethical issues that are involved with this business model.
Sounds good. We'll explore how these companies recruit people and how they keep them. And we'll look at the long-term effects of these practices.
Absolutely.
So stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back to our deep dive into the world of Devil Corps. You know, we've uncovered a lot already from their, shady corporate structures to the really mixed bag of experiences that people have shared. But now I'm curious about the psychology of it all. Like, how do these companies get people to buy into their system, especially when there's so many warning signs?
Yeah, that's a really important question. And I think beyond all the promises and the motivational speeches, there's a deeper level of manipulation going on here.
Okay, so what do we talk about? Like mind control, subliminal messages?
Not quite that dramatic, but they do use certain tactics that can be really effective.
Like what?
One of the key strategies is the use of what we call thought-terminating cliches.
Thought-terminating cliches. That sounds intense. What are those?
These are basically phrases that are designed to shut down critical thinking and to discourage people from disagreeing.
Oh.
They're often presented as motivational slogans or like words of wisdom.
Right.
But their real purpose is to prevent people from having doubts or raising questions.
So like, don't be negative, or winners never quit.
Exactly. Or successful people don't make excuses. These phrases might sound harmless at first,
Right.
but they can be used to silence anyone who expresses concerns or challenges the company's methods.
It's like they're creating this culture of blind faith,
Mm-hmm.
where questioning the system is seen as a weakness.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. They want to create an environment where people just accept what they're told and don't cause any trouble.
And we see this reflected in some of the sources, right? Like the DS Max scam website had this whole list of Devil Corp lingo
Oh, yeah.
with things like JUICE, join us in creating excitement,
Yeah.
and get excited.
That website does a good job of highlighting the specific language that's used to create this emotional atmosphere. Phrases like JUICE and get excited. They're all about fostering this constant state of enthusiasm and positivity,
Really?
even when the reality of the situation might be very different.
So it's not just about selling a product.
Right.
It's about selling a whole emotional experience.
Exactly. They're selling this feeling of being part of something special, of being on a winning team.
And what about this term 5 and 8 that we saw in some of those posts?
5 and 8 refers to the typical workday structure in these organizations. So 5 appointments, 8 hours.
Makes sense.
It's often presented as a badge of honor, a sign of dedication and commitment.
Right, but it also sounds exhausting.
It is. It's a really high-pressure environment.
Yeah.
And that's by design. They want people to be constantly striving to achieve to make sales and recruit new members. And that can be really draining, both mentally and emotionally.
And then there's the whole CI track thing that people mention.
Right. CI Tract likely refers to a training program called Change Incorporated,
Okay.
which is used to basically indoctrinate new recruits into the system.
So it's about changing people into ideal salespeople.
Yeah, people who are fully on board with the company's ideology.
It all sounds a bit like brainwashing.
Yeah, the comparison to cults comes up a lot.
Right.
And for good reason. There are a lot of similarities in the way that these organizations use language, how they create a sense of community, and how they demand loyalty.
And they do this by creating this us versus them mentality, right? Like anyone who works a regular 9-to-5 job is seen as a loser.
Exactly. That's another one of those thought-terminating cliches.
Right.
They put down traditional employment so that their opportunity seems more appealing.
So they're basically saying, if you're not with us, you're against us.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. They create this environment where people feel like they're part of this exclusive group.
Right.
And that anyone who's not in the group just doesn't get it.
And we saw that in the Reddit post about the job interview,
Yeah.
where the interviewer got all condescending when the poster said they preferred a 9-to-5 job.
That's a perfect example of how they use these tactics to shame people into going along with things. They want everyone to buy into their system and reject any other way of life.
So it's not just about selling products. It's about selling an entire worldview.
Absolutely. And a big part of that worldview is this emphasis on individualism and personal responsibility.
Okay.
They push this idea that anyone can be successful if they work hard enough, no matter what their background is, no matter what obstacles they face.
But that ignores all of the systemic issues.
Completely.
And it puts all the blame on individuals for not succeeding.
That's a really important point. Their rhetoric completely ignores the realities of social and economic inequality.
Right.
And they're promoting a system that ultimately benefits the people at the top while exploiting the people at the bottom.
And this whole worldview seems to tie in with the social isolation that we see in a lot of these cases, right? Like discouraging employees from spending time with people who don't support their involvement in the business.
Yeah, that's another common tactic. They want to limit any outside influences
Right.
that might challenge their narrative or encourage people to leave.
So it's like they're trying to create a bubble where their ideas are the only truth.
It's about controlling information and maintaining their influence over people.
And that isolation makes it so much harder for people to realize what's happening.
Absolutely. When everyone around you is saying the same thing, it can be really hard to see things clearly.
Yeah, it's a classic cult tactic.
Totally. They isolate people from their support systems and make them more dependent on the group.
So they're selling a dream, they're using manipulative language, and they're creating a culture of isolation.
Yeah, it's a pretty effective combination.
It is. But then we have this post from the Our Devil Corp subreddit.
Okay.
Had the opportunity to talk with a Smart Circle owner.
Interesting.
And it presents a totally different perspective.
It's important to consider all sides of the story. This post challenges the prevailing narrative and suggests that not everyone has a negative experience.
And here's a quote that sums it up. I'm sorry to who this may offend, but it seems like most of the people in here often are coping with either failing at sales or getting a CI tract and losing it. And it's the same maybe 50 people who comment on most posts and stir up the most.
That's an interesting take. It suggests that the really negative voices online might just be a small but vocal minority.
Right.
And that there are plenty of other people who are finding success and fulfillment in these companies.
And it also highlights the potential for confirmation bias.
Oh, absolutely.
Where people look for information that confirms their existing beliefs.
We have to be careful not to assume that one person's experience is representative of everyone's experience.
Right.
It's important to consider all the different viewpoints and acknowledge that people's experiences can vary widely.
So we've got this whole range of experiences and perspectives.
Yeah.
What do we make of it all?
I think the key takeaway is that it's a nuanced issue.
Right.
There are no easy answers. We have to be wary of those overly simplistic narratives, whether they're positive or negative. And we have to approach this topic with an open mind and a critical eye.
So we've talked about the psychological tactics, the social isolation, the financial realities, the ethical dilemmas. It seems like there's a lot to consider here.
There is. And I think it's important to remember that we're not just talking about some abstract business model here.
Right.
This is affecting real people's lives.
Yeah, people who are often young and ambitious and looking for a better life.
Exactly. And I think we have a responsibility to shed light on these practices and help people make informed decisions about their careers and their lives.
Well said. So where do we go from here? What are the next steps in understanding this whole thing?
In part 3, we're going to explore the regulatory challenges surrounding these companies.
Okay.
We'll look at why it's so difficult to hold them accountable and what can be done to protect workers from exploitation.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Devil Corp. We spent a lot of time talking about the psychology and the tactics these companies use. But now I'm wondering, if this business model is so bad, why are these companies still allowed to operate? Like, who's watching them?
That's the question a lot of people ask. And the truth is, regulating these companies is really hard for a few different reasons.
Okay, so like, what makes them so slippery? Why are they so difficult to catch?
Well, first of all, there's the constant name changing and restructuring we talked about. It's like they're always one step ahead. By the time anyone catches up, they've already changed their name or how they're structured.
Right. So they're like chameleons.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then there's the whole independent contractor thing.
Right, because that kept coming up in the sources. How does that protect them?
By calling their workers independent contractors instead of employees, these companies avoid a lot of the rules about labor. They say that their workers are basically running their own businesses.
So they could say, hey, it's not our fault what they do.
Exactly. It creates this loophole where it's really hard to hold the main company responsible for what's happening in the individual offices or with their sales force.
It sounds like a pretty easy way to get out of taking responsibility.
Yeah.
But is anyone trying to stop them?
There are. Some lawmakers want stricter rules about who can be called an independent contractor. They know that companies are taking advantage of the system, and there's also been a lot more attention on this problem, partly because of those online communities where people share their stories.
Right, like all this stuff we've been looking at on Reddit and YouTube.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The internet has given people a way to speak out when they might not have been able to before. They can connect with others and warn people about what's going on.
It's like they're fighting back against these huge corporations.
That's a great way to put it. They're using their voices to demand better treatment. And as more people become aware of the problem, it puts pressure on lawmakers to do something about it.
So what can we do as individuals to protect ourselves from these companies?
The most important thing is to be informed. Do your research before you accept any job offer, especially if it sounds too good to be true.
Yeah, like trust your gut.
Exactly. Don't be afraid to ask hard questions during the interview and watch out for any pressure tactics. Like if they're downplaying what the job really involves, and if you're in a situation where you feel like you're being taken advantage of, remember, you're not alone.
Right.
There are people you can talk to, there are groups that can help,
Yeah.
and you have rights as a worker.
It's about knowing your rights and speaking up.
Exactly.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have.
We've gone through the history, the psychology, the ethics, and how hard it is to regulate these companies.
It's been a fascinating and sometimes disturbing look into this world.
Yeah, but it's so important to talk about it.
It is.
Yeah.
The more we understand about these companies and how they work, the better we can protect ourselves and others.
So as we wrap up, what's the main thing you want our listener to take away from all of this?
Think critically, be informed, and don't be afraid to question things.
I love it. Great advice. And to everyone listening out there, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it insightful and maybe even a little empowering. Remember, knowledge is power, and the more we know about this, the better choices we can make. So stay curious, keep learning, and we'll see you next time.
See you then.